Welcome to the next module on action research. I'm Dr. Samuel Sennett from Portland State University, and I'm excited to tell you about this topic of action research. We define it first as any systematic inquiry conducted by teachers, administrators, counselors, or others with this vested interest in teaching and the learning process or environment for the purpose of gathering information about how their particular classroom or schools operate and how they teach and how their students learn. This concept of research being done by educators for themselves. I think this is a really nice message for all teachers to, in my interpretation, this word reflection always comes up. That action research is being reflective. There may be pressure in different ways for performance in teaching, and I think this is a positive pressure that we expect a lot out of ourselves as practitioners and clinicians. Whether you're a BCBA looking at a student that you meet with for the first time that may have challenging behavior or need a lot of skill development, to an early interventionist holding an infant in your arms, you feel that what would we call it? The motivation to serve. And, sometimes this, external pressure and the idea of, research and showing data that it doesn't necessarily fit with what you're doing and the way you look at it. You may like action research. You may be a researcher in your practice. And I'm thinking of teachers that I know are taking this course right now, and I think about how reflective you are. And some of you I've had in class or seen in your practice just in different ways, and you are trying things out. You can do research in your classroom. It may not be published research, but it might be this work that parallels action research, or may even be action research. And so the goal is to improve your own practice. And this word comes up, reflection. That's a key component. And it's this critical exploration of what you're doing. And it's this iterative practice and reflection and more practice and iteration. This design thinking concept that I introduced around the proposal development process, that has a parallel to action research. You're trying things out and looking at the outcome. And this has a system to it, and we're going to go over some of the methodologies and what it is, just to share a little bit more definition before we get into that. Process that improves education, and it's this reflection and change process. It's a process of educators working potentially collaboratively to improve practice. It can be very persuasive and authoritative. Clinicians sharing from the depths of their experience is visceral. It can be collaborative and participative. That's a funny word. Participatory is what I usually say. It's very practical and relevant, and it's about developing this critical reflection about your own teaching practice. So a lot of good stuff here. It's a planned and systematic approach. You're really testing out your ideas. It has this connection to being open-minded and trying to innovate. And along with that reflective process, we use the term cyclical. It's a cyclical process of planning, acting, developing, and reflecting, just like that design thinking process. So the justification of one's teaching practice, you may get data and work or outcomes that validate some of your practices. Now let's contrast it. It's not just reflection, right? It's not just problem solving or innovating. It's it's conclusive or a fad. It's not that type of research, right? It doesn't show um, efficacy that can be generalized per se. That being said, I just want to underline how important clinical evidence is, how important it is what people find who are on the front lines being teachers or paraprofessionals. That data matters. So while it may not be conclusive scientifically, it still matters. Okay, so that's a nice balance to consider. Um, and so this next step that we're going to explore here is to consider two questions. This might help you. First, why would I want to become involved in an action research project, especially with how busy I am today? And then, if the benefits are so substantial, why doesn't everyone do action research? Well, most people aren't that systematic and that intentional about exploration. Um, and those are good questions, right? So you can explore those. And some of the rationale to kind of sell you on this a little bit more is to connect theory to practice, to improve practices, to improve your school. If everybody's doing this in your school, you could be having all kinds of improvements. It's very empowering to reflect on your own practice. And so I don't know, I just think about the early interventionists out there doing home visits and out in classrooms, um, and how, especially it seems to me, some of the youngest children, we really have to explore what will work. Um, we don't have as much history with these kids sometimes, and anyways, it can be for a lot of the kids we serve that they're almost like puzzles. So, as special educators, we need, I believe, we need reflection and this type of inquiry in almost everything we do. And this could be a really great way to promote your professional growth. You all are conducting these proposal, or you're developing your proposals, right? You're conducting the proposal development process. You could say it that way. Um, and it's so cool to see you all growing. Like, you can see the aha moments happening and people, you know, connecting really good ideas and then going out and finding literature. And I know a lot of you are starting to read some of these papers you're finding. It's so cool. So you're emulating this process already. So just some of the types, and while I'm not real familiar with this lingo, the author of the textbook is a real guru in this area. So we can pay attention to the nice content here. Participatory action research. This concept of participation usually means that you're going to include the community you're serving, whether it be the kids or parents or other teachers. And then this concept of practical action research. This is intended to address a specific problem. You're really targeting. It's less philosophical, more of a how-to. Um, and so some of the assumptions to think about are that, excuse me, that individual teachers are capable of doing this level of investigation. And this concept of continuous improvement through critical reflection is really key. And then also, action researchers are capable of really fleshing out the full plan, not just starting the inquiry or laying it out, but teachers are very capable of doing this type of work. So this cyclical aspect is really key. And the general model that's laid out in the text is the planning stage, acting stage, developing stage, and reflecting stage. So let's look a little bit more in depth at that. So we may go through multiple cycles of that process. And you can see here cycle 1 and cycle 2. And you start out with planning, and then you implement that plan, or stage 2, the acting. And then stage 3, this developing, this is where you're building out and developing your next step, and then reflecting on how that goes. Okay, so it parallels the educational research process like almost everything we do. And this, um, graphic here shows the process with a little bit more depth, and you can read that. You can also go to figure 9.2 in the book and look at that a lot more closely. But again, this planning stage, I think you know what planning is now. It's this defining your topic and really targeting what you're going to look at, gathering information, reviewing literature, developing a plan. And then what can be a little confusing here is this acting stage and developing stage. So I think that the key thing is this acting stage is where you're doing most of the implementing, and then the developing stage is part of this um, responsiveness, where you're developing an action plan. You're responding to what you're seeing, and then reflection or reflecting stage. This is where you're sharing and communicating results, and reflecting on what you'd like to change for this next round of planning. So you can do that reflection, and then you can go back into planning and loop through. So this term, I like this reconnaissance, this process of self-reflection and explanation. Your action plan, this is how you start to develop a proposed plan for implementing results of your inquiry. Um, and the concept of sharing out is a key part of action research. So if we jump into the action planning, like I said, that's a little bit confusing. This specifies your next steps, maybe more formal or informal, and you want to use like a phrase like this: based on what I've learned from my study, I'll do X, Y, or Z, or what should I do now? You might ask yourself that question. So there's different types of these plans. The action plans may be at the individual level, team, school, or district level. Reflection's really baked into the whole process. It's integrated. Um, as you can see, there's reflection in that developing step and in the planning step. I mean, it's all about reflection. And I think that this is really good. We have successes and we also have challenges that we don't always hit it out of the park, if you will, to use a baseball analogy. Thinking about some teachers that are in the class right now, and I know how hard you all work, and I think that it's tricky to add one more thing, and I think that you can do this action research on your own. I think it can be something that's joyful and doesn't really feel like much more. It can just feel like your practice. This is kind of the way I'm doing my work now. I'm a researcher, so it's kind of a little bit unfair because I don't have the same type of clinical practice as many of you. I miss it dearly. I love just being with the kids every day, all day. But I feel a calling to go even further into inquiry and research. I really do. So just to speak to the validity and kind of where this sits in our survey of research approaches, we've discussed qualitative research, and I think you can see a lot of overlap with action research, that you're looking at a lot of qualitative questions at times. But then you might also see that you could be looking at quantitative questions. You might really be trying to measure an outcome in your classroom. So some people criticize action research as just weaker type of research, and I think this this concept of clinical evidence is something I keep coming back to. Um, I'm going to be pointing to in the module a paper by Pat Miranda about practice-based evidence, and you're going to take a quick look at that. I think it'll be interesting to you. It's an easy read, um, and it's a powerful message that you as a clinician have a lot to share. And so this term rigor, um, not something that's a very well-known term, but this refers to validity in action research. It's the quality and validity, accuracy, and credibility of the action research. So it's kind of a believability in a way. Um, and you can enhance that believability by repeating the cycles, and really like prolonged work in an area, showing very clear and persistent observations, and having some experience with the process, having successfully shown insights with action research lends to your credibility. Triangulating data, we learned about this a little bit with qualitative research, that you can get different sources of data that create checks and balances, if you will, to the validity and the reliability of the source. So, for instance, you may triangulate data by collecting some quantitative data that, when looked at independently, would point to a positive outcome. But then we can also go and ask, let's just say it was a paraprofessional working with the child. We could ask about that data and say, the data looked good. Would you rate that as a strong performance? And they may say, yes, it was phenomenal. And that further validates or triangulates the importance of that quantitative data. This member checking, that's basically what I just described, where you check in with different constituents and see if what this data, what you think it's saying, if they believe that too. And I think that the strengths and limitations of action research are very interesting ones, in that this is a research approach that's so much more available to educators. Right? It's possible to do this in almost any setting, and it can be something that can really develop a community of practice. And I'm very, very curious about this. I think I was reading an article by Philip Strain, and he was talking about, he's the founder of the LEAP program, and I was reading about this, and he was saying he was really concerned about where early childhood special education research is at. That previously it was almost like action researchers scaling up their research from their clinical practice to really rigorous science that has experimental controls, like we've started to study about. And he was saying that that's important. It's almost like a keeping it real, and I think action research represents that. And I like that the person, you know, you know, the person doing this can be empowered, basically, and the limitations are none. No, just kidding. It's when you focus on its purpose. It's really, it doesn't have a clear limitation in that way. But you can see, differences. There are weaknesses, and that it's less rigorous, from a scientific standpoint, and it's a little more subjective. Of course, there's potential for some bias of the researcher or clinician, and the generalizability could be very limited. It might not be the goal, though. You might be really trying to figure out a problem in your school. So I think this table showing action research and more formal research, it's a very fascinating set of comparisons. I urge you to go through them one by one in the text, and you can look at it here as well. So I just, again, this idea of that you can get started with this. basically a lot of your proposals, your grant proposals, are very similar to action research. I didn't specify that you have to do a research study per se for your proposal. I really tried to use that wording of just grant project proposal. And so you're free to interpret that. It's your project. I want you to really own it. I want you to think about for yourself about these comparisons. Um, for me, as a practitioner, I liked reading research to a certain degree. I thought it was cool or interesting, but I didn't ever see myself as a researcher. If there's anything you take from this class, I want you to take that you know the research process. You know the scientific method. And now you have this survey of all these different approaches. We call some of them quantitative, some of them qualitative. Some of them are a mishmash or mixed methods. But that you can do this. You can be a part of it. Action research is some low-hanging fruit, if you will. But you may even be able to be a part of formal research. And I'm so thankful that our program has this rigor to it where almost everyone conducts a research project to get their master's degree. That's a beautiful thing. It really helps you understand science, and by doing research, you understand it so much more. But even at this proposal level, you guys are proposing for real. Like, people are into it and fired up. Like, it is so cool to see as a teacher. So congrats to you all on that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the proposal process in the next module, or the next part to the module, I should say. Okay, thank you for listening about action research. I hope you feel that this is possible for you. Don't worry too much about following the guidelines for it. Mainly this process of action, reflection, and iteration is the key concept. Okay, thank you.